Jericho, a city of power, corruption, and divine judgment. Jericho was such an ancient and powerful city that its inhabitants believed themselves to be invincible. Surrounded by gigantic walls, it was filled with wealth, luxury, and limitless pleasures. Yet, at the same time, it was a place where idolatry, corruption, and immorality completely dominated the people's lives. Inside its temples, sexual rituals were performed in the name of pagan gods. Men and women indulged in sin without fear of consequences. They believed nothing could destroy them, until everything suddenly collapsed in an inexplicable way. But what really happened within the walls of Jericho? Why was this thriving desert city completely destroyed? And could its story serve as a warning for today's world? Stay until the end, because what you'll discover about Jericho might change the way you see the world. The ancient mystery of Jericho. Jericho is a mysterious and ancient city, its origins tracing back to the dawn of humanity. A prosperous place, surrounded by massive stone walls, filled with wealth, and recognized as one of the world's first great urban centers. However, it was also a place steeped in idolatry, corruption, and immorality. Now think about this: if you had lived there, inside those impenetrable walls, surrounded by luxury and excess, would you believe that any army could bring him down? The truth is, the inhabitants of Jericho were so confident in their fortress that they never imagined what was to come. The Bible tells us in Joshua chapter 6 verse 1-2, "Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king, and the mighty men of valor." It seems impossible, doesn't it? How could a fortified city, with such tall and thick walls, simply fall? And more importantly, what led God to decree its destruction? Jericho, a symbol of sin and divine judgment. Jericho wasn't just any ordinary city, it was a symbol. Its way of life represented everything that separated humanity from God. Here's something crucial to understand: God is patient, but he does not ignore sin. What happened within those walls went far beyond wealth and trade. Idolatry ruled the city. Its inhabitants worshipped false gods, practiced child sacrifices, and engaged in dark rituals. Corruption infected every level of society, and immorality was so commonplace that no one even recognized it as wrong anymore. But how did Jericho become such a stronghold of immorality? Imagine this: before Rome, before the pharaohs of Egypt, before Babylon even existed, there was already a prosperous and well-established city, Jericho. It was one of the first places where humanity stopped being nomadic and began building something lasting. Jericho, humanity's first steps towards civilization. The history of Jericho dates back over 10,000 years, to what historians call the Fertile Crescent, a region blessed by God, where early humans first learned to plant, harvest, and settle in one place. While other tribes still wandered in search of food, Jericho's inhabitants discovered how to tame the land. The city had something no other region possessed: a freshwater spring in the heart of the desert. And where there is water, there is life. This gift of nature made Jericho a refuge and strategic hub for merchants, shepherds, and travelers crossing the Jordan Valley. The book of Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 3 even calls Jericho the city of palm trees, and for good reason. Thanks to its privileged location, Jericho flourished with plantations of dates, wheat, and barley. But Jericho wasn't just known for its agriculture, it was a pioneer in construction. Archaeological discoveries reveal that its inhabitants built stone walls at the very dawn of civilization, a feat unmatched by any other culture at the time. They understood the need for protection, not just from invaders, but from the harsh desert itself. From prosperity to decadence, a warning for all generations, Jericho was more than an agricultural center, it was a commercial hub. Its strategic position allowed for the exchange of goods between different regions. Salt, spices, fabrics, and precious metals passed through its gates, enriching its citizens even more. But here's the tragic truth: every time humanity prospers, it risks forgetting God. History proves this over and over again. That's exactly what happened in Jericho. What began as a miracle of civilization turned into a city steeped in excess, idolatry, and corruption. But how did this fall from grace happen? What made Jericho stray so far from God's plan and become a symbol of moral decay? The immorality behind the walls of Jericho. Before diving into the city's extreme immorality, let's talk about the luxury within its walls. Jericho wasn't just ancient, it was a symbol of prosperity and ostentation. Anyone who passed through its gates encountered bustling streets, markets filled with valuable goods, and luxurious homes adorned with tapestries and golden artifacts. Merchants from all over came to trade rare spices, exotic fabrics, and precious stones. But behind the glittering surface, there was a dark side few dared to question. Where there is wealth without fear of God, corruption follows. The city's rulers lived in lavish excess, exploiting the resources from trade and the population's labor. Money flowed freely, but with it came sin. Idolatry, corruption, and the fall from grace. Biblical and historical accounts depict Jericho as a place consumed by idolatry. Multiple gods were worshipped, and temples were erected for religious practices that involved questionable rituals, including human sacrifices and sacred prostitution. The true God had been forgotten, replaced by images and beliefs that promise fertility, abundant harvests, and pleasures without consequences. The people of Jericho saw no problem with their customs. To them, their impenetrable walls guaranteed safety, and the gods blessed them with abundance. But what they didn't realize was that every act of corruption, every idolatrous worship, and every immoral practice pushed them further from the truth. Jericho became the ultimate example of what happens when humanity places its trust in wealth and power, disregarding God's principles. History shows that this same mistake was repeated in other civilizations. Rome in its golden age fell into moral and spiritual decay before its downfall. Cities like Sodom and Gomorrah, prosperous yet corrupt, were destroyed for their wickedness. Jericho's destruction, a divine warning to future generations. The mindset that led to Jericho's fall is still present today. The relentless pursuit of pleasure, the reliance on wealth, and the disregard for spiritual values continue to lead individuals and entire nations to ruin. Have you noticed how history keeps repeating itself? Humanity, despite countless lessons from the past, continues to fall into the same traps. But within Jericho's walls, there was another dark reality: how women were treated in this city of corruption. In the next section, we will explore the shocking truths about sexual practices and immorality in Jericho, exposing the full depth of its fall from God's grace. The women of Jericho, sexual practices and immorality. Jericho was not just a city surrounded by physical walls. Within those barriers was another kind of fortress, a culture of immorality that dominated everyday life. To many, Jericho was a commercial hub and the strategic point on the ancient map. But for those who knew its customs, the city reflected the moral decay of that time. Among the many dark aspects of Jericho's society, one of the most striking was the role of women. Were they respected, or merely used to satisfy desires and fulfill pagan rituals? Women of Jericho, power or submission? Contrary to what many might think, some women in Jericho held status and influence, especially those connected to nobility and commerce. However, for the majority of ordinary women, reality was far different. They were often treated as commodities, exchanged in arranged marriages or used in religious rituals dedicated to pagan gods. Female beauty was exploited for political and religious purposes, and in many cases, women had no control over their own lives. Yet, something even more shocking occurred within Jericho's walls: sacred prostitution. Temple prostitution, ritual or justified sin. Ancient peoples believed that the fertility of the land was linked to human fertility. Thus, in temples dedicated to pagan gods like Baal and Ashtoreth, rituals were performed where women were forced to engage in sexual relations with priests and foreigners seeking blessings. These practices were not seen as sinful by the inhabitants of Jericho. On the contrary, they were considered acts of devotion, intended to please the gods for bountiful harvests, protection from enemies, and prosperity. But God saw everything. In Leviticus chapter 18 verse 24-25, the Bible clearly states His judgment on these practices: "Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for by all these, the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled. For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so the land will vomit out its inhabitants." The people of Jericho believed their customs would bring prosperity, but in reality, they were digging their own grave. Rahab, a woman marked by her past but redeemed by her future. Amid this culture of immorality lived a woman named Rahab. She wasn't noble, a priestess, or someone respected by society. On the contrary, she was known as a prostitute. Her house was strategically positioned on the city walls, where many travelers and merchants passed by. She likely heard countless stories about the deeds of the God of Israel and sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. So when the spies sent by Joshua arrived in the city, it was Rahab who hid them and helped them escape. But why did she do it? Because Rahab, unlike the other inhabitants of Jericho, believed in the true God. She recognized that the city's walls couldn't protect him from divine judgment and asked for mercy. Her faith was rewarded. Her family was spared on the day of Jericho's destruction. Rahab's story teaches us that even amid corruption, prostitution, and idolatry, God still seeks those who turn toward him. Was Jericho more corrupt than other ancient cities? You might wonder, was Jericho really different from other ancient cities? The truth is that many ancient civilizations practiced immorality. For example, Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for the same reasons: perversion and total rejection of God's principles. Babylon was also infamous for its luxury and idolatry. However, Jericho carried symbolic weight. It was the first city God's people faced upon entering the Promised Land. Its destruction marked the beginning of a new era for Israel. God was demonstrating that where his people set foot, wickedness could not remain. And now, I ask you, have you noticed how today's society resembles Jericho? The world teaches that everything is permissible, that distancing from God's principles isn't a problem. But are we not rebuilding walls of sin that will one day collapse before the Lord? If you believe that God is still sovereign and can transform even those living in immorality, declare it now in the comments. Jesus is my fortress. The siege and fall, the legend of the collapsing walls. Imagine the tension inside Jericho's walls. The inhabitants, confident in their city's fortifications, believed they were safe. But something unusual was happening outside. The army of Israel, led by Joshua, has surrounded the city. But instead of direct attacks or trying to climb the walls, they did something unexpected. They marched silently around the city. For the soldiers and residents of Jericho, this seemed insane. There were no arrows, no battering rams, no signs of war, just people walking around the city, accompanied by priests blowing trumpets. For 6 days, this scene repeated. Then, on the 7th day, something extraordinary happened. The Bible tells us in Joshua chapter 6 verse 15-16, "But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early, about the dawning of the day, and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner." On that day only, they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At that moment, when the people of Israel shouted with a great cry, the walls of Jericho completely collapsed. What was once considered invincible fell without a single spear needing to touch its defenses. How was this possible? Theories about the fall of Jericho. The fall of Jericho is one of the most mysterious events in ancient history, and many scholars have tried to explain what happened. Some believe an earthquake could have caused the collapse. The Jordan Valley lies along a geological fault line where tremors are common. But even if an earthquake did occur, could it really be a coincidence that it happened the exact moment the Israelites shouted? Another theory suggests the Israelites used psychological tactics to weaken the defenders. The silent march could have generated fear and desperation inside the city, shaking the soldiers' confidence. But that doesn't explain the sudden and complete fall of the walls. For believers, there's no doubt, it was God who brought down the walls. The method used, a silent march, trumpets, and the final shout, has no parallel in known military strategies. Moreover, the destruction was so complete that the city never rose again with the same power. If this reflection resonates with you, leave a like as an act of trust in God and share in the comments what surprised you most about Jericho. The impact of Jericho's fall. The destruction of Jericho was more than just a military victory, it was a message to all the nations inhabiting Canaan. The God of Israel was fulfilling his promise and delivering the land to his people. The neighboring cities heard about Jericho's fall and trembled. Their kings feared the arrival of the Israelites, realizing they were not dealing with an ordinary army but with a people protected by the Almighty God. Jericho's fall also marked a significant moment for Israel. It was their first great victory after leaving Egypt. Just as God had parted the Red Sea to free them from slavery, now he tore down walls to show that nothing can prevent his plans from being fulfilled. And now I ask you, how many walls exist in your life today? Walls of fear, doubt, sin, or situations that seem impossible to overcome. The story of Jericho teaches us something vital. When God gives the order, even the mightiest fortresses fall. If you believe God can tear down the walls in your life, declare in the comments, "My victory comes from the Lord." Beyond Jericho, A warning to all generations. Jericho fell, but it wasn't the only city destroyed by God's judgment. There was another place, perhaps even more wicked, where immorality and corruption reached an extreme level: Sodom and Gomorrah. What happened there was even worse. Click the video on the screen to learn about the uncontrolled sexual practices, violence, idolatry, and a people completely surrendered to sin. But what truly led God to destroy those cities with fire from heaven? And has archaeology found evidence of that destruction? The story of Jericho is more than history. It's a powerful reminder that no wall can stand against the will of God.